I can see the person of talent who desires the absolute utmost from the build and the most absolute perfect score every game in a BG. I can tell that you're in the wrong place. Go play stand play. This build ain't for you. So before we actually get started with this deathmatch BG build, let me just give some background information, a little bit of sprinkling here and there. This is going to be more of a heavy attack build based around Magical Sorcerer, so it's going to be utilizing things like Restoration heavy attacks and Lightning Staff heavy attacks to do the most sustained heavy damage, along with a couple of other item sets and pets to really just allow for the full utility of this build. It's kind of in an unorthodox fashion. So with that in mind, let's actually go over some of the interesting abilities we got here. So as you can see, we do have a Restoration Staff on our back bar, and on our front bar, we do have a Lightning Staff heavy, as you can tell based on the Wall of Elements right there. So to actually go over the abilities here real quickly, let me just give a little background and reasoning as to why we're using such abilities. So let's go with the back bar first off. So we have the Summon Twilight Matriarch and the Volatile Familiar. The reason why for the Twilight Matriarch, simple, you need a heal, you need some burst healing. And this one just allows you to heal not only yourself, but also your allies. So if you're going to be doing a deathmatch BG, this is really useful for not only just healing yourself up in times of need, but also healing up your allies in case they ever get damaged. And in deathmatch BG, that'll actually give you a supreme amount of points, at least through the heroic healer, through the medic perks, through the minor mending perks. You get a lot of extra points through this, so it's a nice ability to have. The Volatile Familiar, simply put, really nice AoE damage, really nice AoE stun at the final tick, so it actually does get you a lot of assists pretty dang easily, as well as also just provides a nice amount of utility with an AoE stun and AoE DPS that always provides a little bit of extra pressure. Same thing with the Twilight Matriarch to some degree. Twilight Matriarch is able to apply single target pressure to an individual that you're currently poking, and it's also ranged. So the Twilight Matriarch is able to stay out of harm's way usually, as well as does a decent amount of damage. You could also go for the other variation of the Twilight Matriarch if you want to go for more damage output, say if you had a dedicated healer and you don't really need to actually back bar healing, then you could do that variation as well. But with this in mind, I'm usually going with the thought process of an individual who is going to go into a game that'll probably only be the mixed healer DPS combination there, since most people tend to rock a just pure single target DPS build. So going on to the rest of the abilities, we have Mutagen. Of course, if you're going to have a restoration bar, you might as well have one of the low effort skills that actually adds a whole lot of utility for the teammate, just because it actually heals for a crap load, 13,000 over 20 seconds. Pretty nice healing. As well as it also just gives you that nice burst healing of around 4,000 to 5,000 when they get low, which is really nice for somebody who is just doing a single one-on-one brawl. As well as also just removes a dot, which are super prominent in BGs nowadays, especially with the utilization of dual wield or DKs. This actually helps out immensely, and I've gotten many medic, heroic healer, or mining mending perks just because of this mutagen. Cast it twice, get on all three of your allies, there you go, you're good, you're solid, you're healing for a couple of thousand, and you're actually adding a considerable amount to the team dynamic. As for the other buffs, these ones are fairly standard with any sort of Magical Sorcerer or just really Sorcerer build in general. We have Power Surge and Boundless Storm, which Power Surge meshes absolutely wonderful with Race, but we'll talk about that later. Of course, it just provides you with the spell damage buff as well as the healing every time you critical strike, which is really nice for keeping yourselves up in BGs. And the Boundless Storm, of course, because it gives you the major expedition to run around the field pretty fast. It's fairly low cost, gives you a bunch of resistances to physical and spell, which is really nice to keep you alive, especially if you're a cloth user, as well as also just dealing some nice damage for 23 seconds, which is a stupidly long buff, but it's absolutely wonderful to have for any sort of brawl, or if you're facing a Nightblade that's running away. Super useful to have. As for the ultimate, where you're going to be using Absorption Field, you could use the other variation of this field. I believe it's called Suppression Field. that allows you to actually deal damage. That's also a very nice variation. But with the restoration bar, I kind of wanted to keep with the theme of healing, so I thought this actually helps out considerably. However, you also kind of have to communicate with that with your team. Your team is probably going to think you have the damage variation of this ability, as well as also not knowing that you have this ability, because it's not very clear in terms of aesthetic which one is a friendly, which one's a enemy absorption field. So make sure you tell them that you're going to be using this ability, and if it comes out, you can stand in it to actually get a little bit of healing. So just like type that in there, please. It will save you so much headache when your entire team, for some reason, just dips out of it when they're all in need of some major healing. Trust me, it'll help you. It'll help you. So going on to the next bar, but I guess we could also discuss potential other variations. If you don't like using mutagen, you could use a different variation of all these other abilities. I mean, you could also use the Panacea Ultimate if you don't like using the suppression field. You could also use Grand Healing if you don't like using mutagen, or you can kind of use the Blessing of Protection if you want to actually provide some more upfront and really powerful healing. But that just kind of depends on your play style. I tend to play more of a loosey-goosey when it comes to actual healing, so this tends to help out considerably. And interesting, I didn't actually have this out. Whoops. So going on to the actual first bar here, this is our lightning staff, by the way. We have a fairly similar loadout. So of course you had to have the pets on both bars, otherwise you'd have to constantly resummon these pets, and that would be getting very cumbersome every time you switch your bar in PvP. So those are the same. For the ultimate, we have the Greater Storm Atronach. The reason why for this is just because it has a very nice synergy with any of your allies that's able to utilize it, as well as it also just being a great way to survive, because all of your pets have a hitbox, and the Storm Atronach has a massive hitbox. So you can actually hide inside your Storm Atronach if you want to actually do a one-on-one brawl scenario, say if somebody's spamming Wrecking Blow, they'll probably hit your Atronach a fair bit. So it helps out immensely to have something like this when you're brawling somebody, as well as it also just being able to do a decent amount of damage and last forever. Because as you can see, that duration is 28 seconds. Oh my goodness, that is so good. And on top of that, having that pet constantly zap somebody to slow them down is also really useful for picking off people. So if your allies are able to synergize with your Atronach and go after that one target it's focusing, even better, because that guy will be instantaneously melted. So it's a really nice ability to have all around. You could go for the AoE variant if you find yourself in a situation in which you're constantly within the range of 3 or 4 people that are in a very close proximity. But usually I find that as soon as you place the Atronach, people tend to disperse, so the AoE variation doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. That's mostly a PvE variant. When it comes to the other abilities, we do have Hardened Ward. Of course, that's just for your survivability, as well as also for your pet survivability, because you actually find out that these pets tend to actually follow the people they're targeting quite consistently and run out of your line of sight. So having a way to actually heal them or control them does help out immensely to increase your survivability. Because you don't want to have to summon these pets multiple times throughout a fight, because these things have a cast time, and not only can you be interrupted, it also just prevents you from using other abilities or doing dodge roll. I mean, it's a very cumbersome thing to do in BG, so the less you can do, the better. And on top, that Hardened Ward's not really that cumbersome an ability to use either, since there is no cast time, it's instantaneous. As for the other abilities, this kind of depends more or less on your playstyle. We do have Daedric Prey here, which just synergizes well with your Atronach and your 2 pets. So that will just increase your damage of your pets by 55% and your Atronach by 40%. So if you have that on somebody consistently, they're going to be getting hit hard by your pets. Extremely hard by your pets. And people don't initially think it's going to be that hard, but then you realize the fact these pets have all your buffs at full value. So these mother truckers hit you with like 2,000, 3,000 zaps every time, and it instantaneously melts very squishy targets. So it's really nice to have, as well as just that upfront burst damage as soon as it blows up, which is beautiful to have. When it comes to Blockade of Storms, this kind of just depends as well. I tend to use Destructive Reach just because it's a nice stun that allows me to synergize well, but I also realize that Volatile Familiar has a stun as well, so it kind of weirdly inhibits each other in a way. That, and I find that Destructive Reach is not very effective because you have Nightblades and DKs that you often face within BGs, and DKs will spam Reflective Scales all the dang time, so you'll rarely get that thing going off. Nightblades will cloak it, and you'll never hit them, or people will just dodge roll, and it doesn't do anything. So Destructive Reach has kind of seen less and less, well, functional utility as time has gone on, just because of the prevalence of dodge rolling, of cloaking, of reflective scales. So why not just go for something that is undodgeable and use Blockade of Storms? Because now this is a massive AoE that brings Nightblades out of stealth, that DKs can't reflect, that does a crap load of damage, and can hit multiple people. For example, if you're in that Alien Ruins BG scenario, this is absolutely one of the best abilities to use, especially if you're in any of those cram situations, because now you're able to do like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 DPS a second just with this thing alone, as well as the fact that it also causes a lot of people to get off balance, as well as kills a lot of pets. So it actually has a very huge synergistic effect with that, as well as it also just doing very nicely with your heavy attack lightning staff usage. So then you do just a lot of passive AoE that applies a lot of pressure to not only the DPS who are getting damaged, but to the healer who has to heal all of that. So it's really nice, kind of a synergistic combination. However, you could also use Crushing Shock if you're facing a lot of situations in which people are, say, casting abilities that are channeled. This will help out as well, and it's also unblockable through scales, so it's not that bad of an ability. You could also use Force Pulse, but that's mostly for PvE damage amplification, so not really the best. Impulse could work, but it doesn't really synergize well with Lightning Staff heavy attacks, as well as also just being kind of cumbersome to use. There's also a ability that you can use in lightning abilities called Liquid Lightning. Super useful ability, essentially does the same thing as Blockade of Storms, except this thing, if you want to get a similar range and radius, you would have to use the 6-second variation, which means you get 2 less seconds, as well as just the fact that this ability also requires you to tap twice. And tapping twice in BGs is just a little bit cumbersome, especially if you spam it multiple times over. Because then if you do that, you realize, okay, well now this thing's up, I gotta right-click to get rid of it. It just doesn't really seem to synergize well with the frantic nature of BGs. So Blockade of Storms is much nicer, because then you can just cast that, you're done, and it has a massive reach. So you have the potential of doing a lot of DPS. So that's just the kind of the general abilities that I tend to use for this character. But as you can see, this build is very open form, and you can do certainly a lot of things that you want to do. So let's go on to talk about armor next. So when it comes to armor, of course, it's going to be a fairly standard affair for some situations. So, of course, you want impenetrable on all your body pieces, sharpened on your lightning staff, your main damage dealer. And for restoration staff, I tend to go more precise for the extra bit of critical and for the extra bit of healing potential. Of course, you could also just go for the healing variation if you're just really concerned about pumping out that extra bit of heals. But I find that decisive also allows you to still keep that damage potential too, so this still just kind of depends, but Impen is a definite must. As for the actual body pieces, we actually do have a couple of interesting sets here. So we're using Maw of the Infernal. The reason why for this is just because it has a hitbox of itself, so it absorbs a lot of damage in BGs, and I've been in multiple situations where Maw of the Infernal has absorbed a Berserker's Onslaught, or an Incapacitating Strike, or a Meteor. It's been multiple situations which has happened, not to mention the poison injections, the light attacks. All of these things are super useful. That and Maw of the Infernal is absolutely beautiful at chasing down people who are running away, especially Nightblades, because this guy has a conal AoE damage thing that actually pulls out a few Nightblades out of stealth occasionally, as well as just applies dots, does a lot of damage. It's a very nice helm set to have in BGs, especially in a tight scenario. So I mean, just imagine if you had Maw of the Infernal, Twilight Matriarch, Unstable Familiar, and your Atronach out. That is 4 enemies with hitboxes that are all blocking the view of other people. An extremely nice kind of synergistic effect, as well as it also just giving you a crapload of survivability. And of course, all Impen. As you can see, mine are actually heavy variations, and that's just so that it can actually have a little bit more health, a little bit of extra regeneration, and a little bit more resistance. If you are feeling a little bit more lucky and you feel like you can survive more, you can go ahead and switch these to light armor variations and change these out instead of health to magicka variations. Because as you can see, my health right now is 23,000, and that's even with my food buff. In BGs, that would actually be a tad bit higher. For everything else, of course, it's going to be light armor. As you can see here, we have the Night Slayer robe, and the reason why we want to have this is not just because of the extra health, but because of the heavy attack doing Oblivion damage. That is a really, really nice effect to have when you're facing any sort of character that is blocking, spamming shields, or is incredibly resistful to just generic damage. So this just allows you to go straight through all of that and do 9%. Facing somebody with 40,000 HP, guess what? Every single one of your heavy attacks now will do about 4,000 damage of Oblivion. Not to mention all the other damage on top of that with your heavy attack ticks, the final heavy attack, the lightning staff, the pets, the everything. It just applies nice amount of pressure that cannot be blocked. And is really useful for people who are actually spamming shields but have a very low HP, because that will just go straight through their shield and hit them and kill them. I've had many situations in which my Night Slayer robe has actually effectively finished off many people, so it's a nice ability to have when you're doing a lot of heavy attacks. As for the other set, we're going to be using the Mad Tinkerers, and this is just mainly because of its synergistic effect in BGs. It does a nice amount of shock damage, which is always useful, but as you can see, every time you do damage, you have a 10% chance to actually summon a Vicious Fabricant that charges and stuns and knocks up people. Really useful to have. I've been in many situations in which I've been Dawnbreakered, which instantly stuns you and instantly damages you, but then you have this Mad Tinkerers come out, charges, and then stuns the entire enemy team, so that at that point you basically have just stopped their advancement and allowed yourself to actually kind of counter it. So this Mad Tinkerers set allows you to not only initiate, but allows you to also basically give yourself a second life. So it's a really nice set to have, really nice set to have. And it's also, these are not really expensive sets. As you can see by the price tags listed by TTC, by Tamiel Trade Center, you can see that most of these sets are less than 2,000 gold. So this is a very inexpensive set to actually acquire. You can go onto TTC's website right now, search in the item set pieces, and literally look for Impen, and you can find it pretty cheaply around Tamriel for super cheap prices, as well as you can just farm it yourself. As for the use of jewelry, it's going to be, of course, arcane with spell damage enchants. You could switch this out with whatever you're feeling with, like Triune or whatever stats you're really trying to maximize, but I just tend to do it for the extra bit of damage. For the staffs, of course, they're the Mad Tinkerers with the Sharpened and Precise. These enchants are mostly going to be on the Lightning Staff, that being the weapon damage and spell damage enchant. Super nice for just generic damage increase. For the Mad Tinkerer staff, I tend to use Restoration as a bit of a Magicka regen. So I tend to use the Magicka Restore chant, which is really nice for getting a little bit of extra Magicka to spam those heals. Everything else is just extra Magicka or health, depending on what you like. So that's the armor. There's also a couple of armors that I really originally did test with. I did try to use more Colton initially with this build, but since it's a stamina build, yeah, you can't really use more Colton. It's a very minimal DPS. That, and apparently it's having a very hard time summoning. Even though I'm heavy attacking all the time, more Colton itself is having a very hard time actually proccing. So I wouldn't really use more Colton, as well as the fact that more Colton doesn't have a hitbox, so it really doesn't help you out. There's also Infallible Aether, and Infallible Aether is not that bad either. It allows you to have your team do more damage towards a certain target, as well as just enhance your heavy attacks, which is also kind of nice, but this damage can also be blocked and cleansed, so it's not really the absolute utmost best. Of course, you could also use Icy Conjurers, which is applying that non-reflectable Icy Wraith that does a crap load of damage. That could be useful, but the thing is you have to apply a minor buff. So if you wanted to use Icy Conjurer instead of Mad Tinkerers, you'd also have to use Infallible Aether, so you have to use Infallible Aether and Icy Conjurer, and you wouldn't have that 9% Oblivion damage from Night Slayer. So it's kind of a balancing act as to what you want. That and Infallible Aether and Icy Conjurer cannot be purchased. You'd have to go farm those out yourself. So those also are a little bit harder to actually access as well. But like I said, that just kind of depends on what you're actually going for. So that's it for armor. So let's go ahead and move on next to our fancy dancy champion points. So going on to this, we have our food, race, potions, and Mundus Stone talk. So With this character, it tends to actually be a Khajiit, and the reason why I do that is because the racials synergize well with Sorcerer. Basically, the Feline Ambush synergizes really well with the Power Surge ability, so you actually do get a lot of critical strike with this, so it actually enhances this, which increases the healing you get from this, so it's just a very nice synergistic effect, as well as also just critical damage is nice overall. The other racials with Khajiit they're okay as well. The Lunar Blessing gives you just raw stats everywhere, which is always nice, and the Robustness gives you a little bit of extra recovery, stamina, and magic recovery, so you can't really go wrong with any of the Khajiit passives. Of course, they're not the creme de la crop when it comes to, say, particular damages, but I find to tend to be the most applicable. Of course, you could also go with Breton if you want more sustain. You could go with High Elf if you want a little bit more damage. So you go with the other races. There's really no wrong answers. I mean, if you go Orc or, say, Redguard or Nord, you may find yourself with a little bit less utility from your racial passive. So Khajiit's just kind of like a nice little balance here. So going over the other shenanigans we also have the food and potions. So I tend to use the Osga's Red Frothgar just for the little bit of extra health to keep you alive more often, as well as giving you that magic recovery, which is really useful for any situation in which you are going to be healing a lot. So then you can actually spam more of your heals. The other ones you could go for are your melon-baked Parmesan pork. Super nice for getting that extra magicka, which is really useful if you want to do more damage. So that's not a bad choice either. That helps out, but then you're also going to be sacrificing your sustain. However, if you want to go for like the best of all worlds, the Witch Mother's Potent Brew is also a very nice kind of in-between all worlds. So you get that extra survivability through health, you get that extra magicka, and you also get that extra magic recovery. So if you kind of want the best of both of the Frothgar and the Parmesan pork, this works out just fabulously well too. The Frosted Brain also kind of works if you don't really want to care about the... If you don't care about the health, you could go for this, which gives you the extra health recovery and magicka. Not really as useful as the other foods, but it technically can work, so if you want to use that, by all means feel free. For our potions, we use the standard Try Restoration with the Detect Pots of Magicka. If you want to use those whenever you're facing a Nightblade, those always are very helpful. Of course, this is the Magicka variation, so you get the extra Sorcerer and the Magicka, so it's a little bit more applicable. Try Restoration, of course, it's just for the healing, the extra stamina when you dodge, roll, or block, and the Magicka to spam more heals. So all of this is super useful. The Try Restoration Crown Potions, they're essentially the same thing, just a weaker variation. That's what I tend to use. You can use other potions if you feel necessary for it, but these are the ones that I tend to use as well. Going for the actual Mundus Stone, I tend to use the Thief, and that's just because it actually synergizes well with, again, the Khajiit passive, as well as the Power Surge ability. So these are actually very nice little synergies you can apply that increase your healing, that increase your DPS, that increase your healing output to your allies. So it's just kind of a nice little thing to synergize in total. You could go for the variation that increases your spell penetration or your max magicka or your spell power. All of those are fabulous options as well. You really can't go wrong either way. You could also go for the one that increases your health if you feel inclined to increase your survivability, become a tank. But like I said, that kind of mostly depends on what you feel is necessary for your build. Face a lot of tanks, maybe spell penetration is in the realm of possibilities to utilize. But like I said, that mostly just depends on what you want. Going over everything else, that should be it. So let's go on to next, the testing aspect of this build. Now, of course, with this build, you want to immediately summon your pets as soon as you get into the BG and try to keep these guys up at all times. These guys are your lifeline for DPS as well as for just general survivability, because then you can hide inside these guys' little hitbox themselves. So say if somebody's spamming, poison injection or light attacks, these things can absorb a lot of your DPS, and you can just kind of shield them up too if you're concerned about their HP and survival. But generic opener that you go on to somebody in, say, BG, of course, summon your passive buffs, Power Surge and Storm, with 2 mutagens to make sure that your allies are nice and covered with it. And then you also just want to open up with a couple of light attacks mixed with all of your abilities, just for the kind of extra bit of damage here. So you just want to make sure that you have your Curse up at all times, as well as your Storm. And the thing is, your storm doesn't have to be up all the time, just in situations in which you feel that you're going to be battling 2 or 3 people at a time. So say you're in a situation in which there are multiple people brawling, that's when you really want to heavily utilize that storm. Or say when you're facing a Nightblade, you place down that storm to actually protect yourself from openers, as well as just to bring them out of stealth. This is a super useful ability for that, so don't be afraid to just spam this multiple times if you feel that you're moving a lot. Say the fight moved over here, alright, play it again, oh, it moved over here, spam it again. It doesn't hurt to actually apply it again, just make sure you're aware of your magicka at all times. As well for the curse is really useful when you're trying to burst down a single target. So you'd apply your curse and your pet ability at the exact same time, your volatile familiar ability, just so that you could really heavily damage a single individual, and it really helps out. Alright, and you want to make sure that every time that you're using this ability, you want to make sure that you're applying a heavy attack in between each one of these abilities, so that you actually have your heavy attacks going off at every time, just so that you have a little bit of extra magicka, as well as that you're getting the full utilization out of the Maw and out of the Night Slayer set. Of course, Night Slayer is not working on this because this is a PvE target and not a player. You would actually see higher DPS on your other characters. So, in what situations would you instead forego Lightning Staff heavy attacks and go for Restoration Staff heavy attacks instead? Well, Restoration Staff heavy attacks do have the nice ability of giving you more magicka, not only because you have the enchant because of its passive as well. So with the Restoration Staff heavy attack, you actually do apply the Major Mending buff. As you can see right there, it lasts for 2 seconds, which allows you to actually spam the Twilight Matriarch here twice for about 5,000 heal across 3 people, which is incredibly useful in any sort of situation in which your allies are taking a lot of damage. So if you notice your allies are taking a lot of damage, make sure you have your Power Surge ability up, your mutagens up. You know, you use a heavy attack, and then you spam the Twilight Matriarch here twice. Another heavy attack. Heal twice over. And you can just see that gives you nice sustain, gives you nice magicka return, and it heals for a crap load. So it's really useful to have that. And just don't be afraid to actually attack, because this also applies the Maw as well as the Night Slayer Plurk itself. So it still actually is applicable on both the Lightning Staff and the Restoration Staff. So don't be afraid to use it if you're actually low on magicka. It does help out. You could always just spam this a couple of times on magicka just to get it all back up. As well as the fact that Restoration Staff also provides healing itself whenever you finish your healing, just through its passive. So you get that Essence String right there, which actually gives you a fully Major Mending for 3 seconds, as well as also just gives you that little bit of extra 33% of your damage as a heal, which is super useful in any situation in which you do have a little bit of extra burst healing. Now for ultimates, this is where it kind of just depends on your situational awareness. So if you're in a situation in which you are being targeted by multiple people, summon that Atronach, do not be afraid. It does a lot of damage, as well as just AoE stuns people. So say you want to initiate onto a group of people, throwing down that Atronach is actually a nice little thing to do, because then you stun everybody for a couple of seconds, or they have to break free, which then causes them to waste their magicka, or their stamina, I should say. So it's really useful to have that. There's also a situation in which if you are concerned about getting hit by a lot of abilities, summoning that Atronach and then hiding inside of it, kind of like something like this, you know, going around in circles around it, actually allows you to have the Atronach absorb a lot of damage. And since you took the Greater Storm Atronach variant, this one has 50,000 HP. So this Brother Trucker can absorb a lot of damage, as well as just get enhanced DPS through the Curse ability. So it's really useful to have. As for the other ultimate, you would really only use the Suppression Field in a situation in which people are in a stationary group, say they're kind of like balling up. You would throw this on top of them to mess over their healer and to kind of like synergize with the other team to do a wombo combo. And I've seen this work out a couple of times. Say if you place this down on top of somebody who's about to use a Dawnbreaker, really nice combination, because then everyone has to break free and then dodge roll out, which uses a crap load of stamina, as well as just allows you to actually do a lot of DPS. So just be a little bit generous. If you also want to be healing with this ultimate, because we did choose the healing variation, throw it on top of your allies, let them heal up for a hot second. It heals them for a couple thousand every 2 seconds, so they'll be fine if you actually throw that down, as well as you just want to heal yourself. So this kind of just depends on your situation. If you're facing a lot of stamina characters, it would probably benefit you just to use the Storm Atronach instead, because at least then you stun, waste some stamina, cause them to take evasive action. That buys you some time. So yeah, it just depends. Facing a lot of stamina characters, Storm Atronach. Facing a lot of magic characters, Suppression Field also opens up as another viable option. So that's just for the generic rotation. Of course, you will get the hand of this the more you utilize it in BGs yourself, and you're actually able to analyze the situation and discern which appropriate rotation is applicable at that time. Single target, is it appropriate to use Blockade of Storms? That just kind of depends on who you face. So you will get a feel for this as time goes on. And if you actually want specific test scenarios, I have streamed this build multiple times, so you can just look through my past archive, watch any of those streams. I'll probably even do a future stream with the same build, so take a look out for that in case you actually want to look at it. So that's for the testing purposes, so let's go on to the actual thoughts portion now. So my thoughts around this build. The build is really kind of a interesting build. It's meant to sort of utilize systems and sets and mechanics that are not available in traditional PvP builds. Most traditional PvP builds tend to be the hyper-mobile builds focused around doing light attack weaving with hard-hitting abilities interwoven with the occasional dot spam or steel tornado spam. This is really just kind of meant to be a different variation on that. Especially with the recent buffs to pets and heavy attacks, it actually has seen a little bit more utilization here and there. So it actually has become a little bit more of a viable build to utilize. And this build is actually fairly useful in situations in BGs, and this is just because of its high point yield you get per game. There have been many situations in which I didn't do 1,000 DPS or 1,000 healing per game, and yet I get 5,000, 4,000 points per game fairly consistently. And this is because the pets itself actually allow you to kind of tick and actually get a lot of actual assist through various combats that you actually may not be engaged in yourself, as well as just the thing having a nice consistent AoE DPS spread that allows you to hit multiple people and apply pressure in a general area of effect. So it's actually really nice to kind of have that. You kind of get that nice little bit of pressure AoE, and it gives you subsequently a lot of points in BGs. But this build also has a nice amount of utility in it with the healing and the mutagen that allows you to actually keep your allies alive in a tough situation, or give them a suppression field when you're facing say a Templar healer that's spamming Breath of Life and you really need to get that bugger down. This really helps out with that too. With everything else, it's not really going to be a build that excels in killing an absurd amount of people and doing the absolute most DPS, but you will actually be doing a fair amount, especially if you consistently apply that heavy attack towards tanks that are spamming block and shields. That'll really help out. The pets themselves actually do apply a decent amount of pressure through their DPS and their AoE stun, so you actually will be able to synergize well with your allies, as well as just the general annoyance your pets will bring actually does add a lot of, say, survivability to not only you but your teammates just through the blocked damage you'll be absorbing. I mean, if there was a way to kind of quantify how much damage your pets absorb throughout a game, you could see that the amount of damage that a person effectively blocked for compared to a tank versus a pet build, you actually see a pet probably actually getting way up there in terms of blocked DPS that actually kind of helps you out. Of course, it may be a little bit of an inflated statistic, but it actually would show that pets do kind of serve more of a purpose just with their presence alone. So it's kind of nice actually utilizing that with a build. That and using a heavy attack build, as you know, pets now actually are targeting whoever you heavy attack. So you're actually able to kind of get a lot more control over where your pets are with this type of build. So it actually does kind of help out really nicely when you're facing any sort of unusual situation. So a lot of things going on with this build that kind of make it a interesting DPS healing hybrid that allows it to really excel in deathmatch BGs. In other situations, you may not see as much utility. In Cyrodiil, I can see this build doing well, just with a large amount of AoE presence it has, especially with the suppression field, especially with the AoE damage, especially with the blockade of storms. That would all apply a nice amount of pressure. However, this would give way to more efficient builds in that scenario. So this is really mostly hyper-focused to deathmatch BGs. You could also use it in flag capture BGs or, say Chaos Ball or Capture the Relic and things like that. So that mostly kind of just depends on the situation, but you can still make it work even in those scenarios. As for everything else, yeah, I just found it to be a little bit more of an interesting build. You can use Maw on this thing, which very rarely can use that in other builds, because usually you're bound by the fact that you're not doing a lot of light attack or heavy damage. So at least with this way, you're actually applying a lot of pressure with everything, and you're actually able to utilize some unconventional sets, which also makes it subsequently a very cheap set to actually acquire too. So in that regard, it's also kind of a huge bonus. So I don't know, I kind of like it like that. But that's just my thoughts of the build. What do you guys think about this build? Is this a build that you guys think about using yourself? Is there any concerns with this build that you actually may have? Or are there any other kind of questions you may have? Let me know below, and I'll see what I can do. But I want to thank you all for joining me today. I want to thank you all for, I don't know, maybe annoying the crap out of people with pets. Join me in this glorious freaking crusade. See them all rise to the top of the leaderboards. I'll see you all in the field next time. Goodbye. Now, when it comes to actual champion points themselves, this is going to be in a battleground build, so champion points are actually not going to be, the biggest concern here. You're not really going to be using champion points unless you're in open world Cyrodiil that specifically allows champion points, or unless you're doing duels, which I really don't do either, because doing champion point anything on PvP is absolutely insufferable. But that is kind of your preference. So let's just go over them just for the genericness. Of course, you want to go for Siphoner because you are going to be doing a lot of heavy attacks. You could bump this up if you want to see a little bit more stamina, health recovery, and stamina recovery all jacked up. So you could bump it up if you want to. Of course, you're also going to be doing a lot of breaking free, so having that there in the 40 range does help out for whenever you get stunned or whenever you get raking blow spam. Super useful, and on top of that, you don't have a lot of stamina to work with, so working efficiently with what you have is really nicely. Of course, when it comes to this, I do tend to use a lot of magic recovery, so having Arcanist does help out. Having the healthy just to increase your overall survivability is really nice. However, you can also equally divide this up into Arcanist and Tenacity to get them to 60-60. That works just as well too. And of course, Tenacity just because you use a lot of heavy attacks. Over here, I usually did this for the Treasure Hunter, so this is not really a PvP focused thing. But having the Tumbling and the Shadow Ward also do kind of help out, because you will be blocking, say, if somebody spams that Soul Assault ability from the Soul Magic skill line. And Tumbling just because occasionally you will have to dodge roll to get out of the way of Wrecking Blow spam or Bow spam or Snipe spam. That kind of helps out too. Going into the actual DPS trees here, we do have a quite equal division among Spell Penetration, Magical Damage, critical damage, and healing. That's because I just tend to do all of these in a fairly equal aspect, so having all these bumped up is really kind of nice. Of course, if you're not worried about healing, you can get rid of this equally divided amongst these to make these 50 apiece. That's also going to be very useful as well. When it comes to this, I tend to actually go about 40 into Staff Expert and 40 into Master at Arms, because that increases your Lightning Staff heavy attack damage and increases the damage you do with single direct targets, like your Lightning Staff heavy attack damage again. So both of these, having these here, does bump it up quite a bit, as well as the fact you also get the Retaliation, which is really nice, or using the Repose or dealing the Butchers. These are also super useful for whenever you're facing anybody that's very low HP, so getting that Butcher, super nice, because especially considering with heavy attacks, you really need to be able to finish that out. And of course over here, you want Thumerage just because you want the extra bit of damage over time damage. So that'll be with the heavy attack, as well as just the Blockade of Storms or the Volatile Familiar passive. So all of these are super nice, as well as also just getting the Opportunist and the Perfect Strikes thing. Does help out a little bit as well. Survivability, this is mostly going to just depend on your build yet again. So with me, I tend to go from more of a spread out approach to everything. So spell resistance, direct damage attack, multipliers, getting these extra perks from the trees. With this one, I tend to go for light armor focus since I tend to be wearing 5 light, so definitely get a lot of extra resistance. Of course, you get the 30, you get the extra 7% reduction in physical, get the extra 7% done to elemental, get the extra damage over time effects reduced by 12%, super nice. As well as the healing and shield experts, these also just kind of help out. You will be getting light attacked a lot, especially with Nightblades who are properly weaving, so getting the expert defender, super useful. 30% to quick recovery, just because you will be healing yourself with Twilight Matriarch. So getting the little bit extra healing is kind of nice. Bastions just for that shield, because guess what? You're going to be spamming Hardened Ward occasionally, not for you, but just your pets. So getting that whole little extra bit of Bastion in there is kind of nice. So as you can see with the orange tree, I tend to actually split everything with 30, but that's just because there's so many more stats you can invest into this tree to actually apply your overall applicability more to enhance it. So there's a lot more things you can do with the orange tree. Green tree and the blue tree, I tend to go 40 into the things that I tend to specialize in. But like I said, this is just what I tend to use. So let's just go once more over just so that you can all see this. Yeah, see? Just so you can see what I've actually spec'd into, so if you want to use this yourself. So pauses on your own leisure and look at it at your own time, but that's champion points. You may not use it very much in a BG situation, but it's there for those who want it. So on to the next one.